Good morning. I'm John Fortier, Director of the Democracy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are here today to have really quite an expert panel talk about the budget and appropriations process. And we're here to talk, of course, about today a little bit, or what will be coming up in the next few months. But I think we have here the expertise to really talk about where we've come from and what we might change in the future. There's a lot of talk about process reform that we have people very involved in here today. So let me make some quick introductions and then jump right in. To my left is Bill Hoagland, who is a Senior Vice President here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, has been the Staff Director of the Budget Committee, an advisor to Majority Leader Frist on the Hill, forgets more about the budget and appropriations process every day than I've ever known. Molly Reynolds, who is a scholar at the Brookings Institution, a scholar of Congress, and in particular of the Senate, with a recent book that I'm going to plug. I don't have it here today, but if you're looking for let's see, what's the next holiday? Labor Day present for your relatives, or I don't know, maybe later Columbus Day, summer reading. That book is called Exceptions to the Rule, and in particular that means talking about the Senate and how there are exceptions to the rule, that often the Senate needs to get a supermajority to pass things, both sometimes in the budget process, but in other ways. And that book is a very timely look at congressional process as it relates to our current debates. And Don Wolfensberger on the end, who is a fellow here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Don spent many years in the House of Representatives. See, we have both the House and the Senate represented here, with the Rules Committee in particular. He rose to be staff director of the Rules Committee. Spent most of his time in the minority, but a few years in the majority, and 2 years, and two is more than two is a few, and certainly in that time thought a lot about congressional reform. Process reform was really there at the beginning of the budget reform process. Don is the author also of a number of books. One, though, I'm going to plug coming out, and in fact, I'm going to tout we will have an event later this year related to that book. But that book is called Changing Cultures in Congress: From Fair Play to Power Plays. And somewhere around Columbus Day this year, we will have that book, and sometime in the late fall, we'll invite you back here to discuss that and what Congress might do to change its rules more broadly. So let's start by thinking about the budget process more broadly. And Bill, this is a very open-ended question, and I don't want you to take the whole 70 minutes, but give us a little bit of background about our budget and appropriations process, how we changed it fundamentally in the early 70s, and what it was meant to do.
Okay, thank you, John. We will truncate this down. And more importantly, you introduced us as experts, and at least speaking for myself, on this day that we're going to celebrate here at BPC, Bob Dole's 95th birthday with chocolate milkshakes, that his favorite drink. He told me one time that an expert was a drip under pressure. So I just want to make it clear that I don't really consider myself an expert in this area. It evolves. Let's begin. From my perspective, we do things in this town in a crisis situation. The 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act came out of a crisis between the executive branch, Mr. Nixon, and the Congress over the power of the purse, who had control. And sometimes we forget the fact that the real issue here was something we went through a little bit earlier this year, was something called impoundment. It was the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And this was the situation, of course, where the president had impounded monies that had been appropriated and authorized. And he said, I am not going to spend the money that you've authorized, and I've signed actually the appropriation, because only I, the President of the United States, have control over fiscal policy. No, you guys up there on the Hill have no idea about what you're doing. Your right hand doesn't know what your left hand's doing. And out of that came a crisis, and the crisis created a special committee that Don knows about, and others, Molly, and out of that came an exercise. It wasn't Watergate per se that created it, but it was the weakness of Watergate that weakened the president, from my perspective, that resulted in the president One of the next to the last acts that he signed before he got on the plane to go back out to California in embarrassment was the Congressional Budget Impoundment Control Act. And it was set up from my perspective to basically create what was at issue here, and that is having a system that so the right hand did know what the left hand was doing. In fact, I argued over the years early on that the Budget Act didn't really have a particular policy outcome in mind. It didn't say you had to run surpluses or deficits. Just said simply let Congress let us know what we're doing so that when we get to the actual beginning of the fiscal year, we know that we're either running a surplus or a deficit. You want to run a surplus or you run a deficit, that's up to you, Congress. So the process itself, I think, was at the outset more of an accounting tool. And from my perspective, for all the years that I was up there, all the way through 2001, 2, I think the system worked pretty good. In fact, I could argue, and I think the facts will point me out, that for the first 34, 35 years of the Budget Act, there were only 3 times that we didn't pass a budget resolution that set a blueprint that set the mechanism in place for Congress to how much to appropriate and how much to spend or how much revenues to raise. But in the last 9 years, and I do not, I'll get into some controversy, I do not count the last 2 budget resolutions that were adopted in 2017, or last year, for the 2017 fiscal year and 2018. I do not consider those to be budget resolutions. They were put in place specifically to overcome the filibuster in the United States Senate for, first of all, the Affordable Care Act, repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which didn't come to pass, but of course the second one, which was adopted last October, very late for 2018, a budget resolution that set up a procedure for adopting the tax bill. One thing I would just want to read that I pulled out this morning, guess who said this, but the budget process has been attacked both within and without as repugnant, redundant, irrelevant, meaningless, misleading, phony, funny money, number crunching, smoke and mirrors. That was Congressman Trent Lott on the 10th year anniversary of the Budget Act. 35, 40 years later, we're still having the same arguments.
I was going to go to Molly. I'll come back to you. I'm going to skip to Don because I did not mention in your bio, of course, that you did work for Trent Lott in the House of Representatives, and you were there at the creation. Would you like to say something about the origins and some of the later history of this?
Yeah, I was going back looking over my papers, and back in 2003 I had a seminar at the Woodrow Wilson Center on the politics of budget deficits, but the subtitle was A Personal History, and it's not because I was financially running deficits, but because the Congress had been, up till that time, since about 1998 or so. But it just occurred to me that when I came onto the Hill in 1969 as a staffer for John Anderson, we were in the last half of Lyndon Johnson's fiscal 69 budget, and that was the last time that we had a surplus until 1997-98, which is when I left the Hill in 97. So I'm thinking, my God, I'm responsible for all this red ink, all those 28 years that I was on the Hill. But it was really interesting coming on at the time that Nixon was inaugurated. In fact, my first day on the staff was Nixon's inauguration day, January 20th, 1969. But there were a lot of exciting things happening then as far as some of his positive recommendations, but then he started to get into some hot water with the Democratic Congress because he was starting to impound funds. I think in the first 2 years alone, he withheld about $40 billion, as I recall, in appropriated funds that had been acted into law. And what to me was really the trigger was when he vetoed a water pollution bill. And if you know Congress, every district benefits from having this money for their sewer systems. And so he vetoed the bill. Congress came back and handily overrode his veto in both houses, and then he turned around and impounded those funds. And this is what sort of set in the motion in Congress, we've got to push back. This is not just for economy or efficiency. This is a policy impoundment, because Nixon said, I didn't ask for that money. And so that's what created the Joint Study Committee on Budget Control in 1972. They reported some recommendations in 73 that eventually worked their way into the House Rules Committee, where I was a staffer for John Anderson, and we went through a markup of the Budget Act. What happened initially, though, was the Democratic leadership wanted to attack the impoundment side first. So both houses passed an impoundment control bill. Anderson said, no, we got to have balance, and he kept fighting that. But it passed both houses, went into conference, got stalled because a guy by the name of Sam Ervin said, we got some constitutional problems here. So it hung up there, so we went back to the House and Senate and brought out a budget bill that had both budget process reform and impoundment control. And to me, that was a pretty fantastic thing, because you had both parties working together to get a balanced system of both a budget process where Congress would have its own budget resolution, its own budget committees, its own budget office, the CBO. And in fact, we have Sandy Davis in the back here, who was a longtime worker on the Congressional Budget Office. But I think that really set up a good system, as much as my boss, Trent Lott, would say how much the budget process was criticized from time to time. I still go back to Rudy Penner when he was CBO director or thereafter, who said, you know, the process isn't the problem is the problem. So when you run into snags in the budget process, it's usually the will of Congress that is more at fault than it is the nature of the process.
So Molly, if I could turn to you, I'm happy to have you weigh in on the origins, but also, you know, maybe you fill in a little bit of the history changes up to today. And then if you could just put on the table your Schoolhouse Rock version of how the budget and appropriations process should work. I don't think there ever was a Schoolhouse Rock video about the budget process, but there should have been. So,
All right, thank you, John. It's really great to be here today, and it's really great to be sitting between two folks who have so much experience working in and with the process. So the one thing that I'll add to the great comments that both Bill and Don have made about the origins of the process is just a point on kind of how the 74 Budget Act fits into how we should think about congressional reform efforts more broadly. And one of the things that I think it illustrates really well is that most major changes that Congress has made to its own operations both address some sort of process shortcoming. So, you know, we talked about efficiency and information as being important parts of what guided the Budget Act, but they also address political problems or the political circumstances that Congress is facing in the moment. And so I think as we think about what might change about the budget process going forward, what options might be on the table right now for reform, it's really important to keep in mind what are not just the process problems, but the political problems and the political issues that the current Congress is facing that a change to how it operates might help address. In terms of the sort of Schoolhouse Rock version of how the budget process is supposed to work, each February, the president releases his budget. Following that, Congress is supposed to produce a budget resolution that, as Bill mentioned earlier, is a sort of top-level blueprint for revenue and spending for the fiscal year. Following from that, the appropriations committees in Congress are charged with allocating the resources within their respect. Each subcommittee has a jurisdiction over different parts of the federal government. That's supposed to proceed basically over the course of the summer, and everything is supposed to be wrapped up with a nice little bow on it by the end of the federal fiscal year, which is September 30th. We know that Congress is quite bad at meeting these deadlines. We were talking beforehand that the last time Congress managed to get all 12 appropriations bills finished by the start of the new fiscal year was for fiscal year 97. So, you know, we are now writing appropriations bills for fiscal year 2019. So that should tell you how long it's been since Congress managed to do this effectively. And so in terms of as we go forward, thinking about what parts of the process we might look to change to make it work better, we really want to kind of hone in on what are the big challenges that Congress is facing in terms of its ability to get this work done in a timely and predictable manner.
Could I just add on the process that Molly outlined so nicely, and that is that the President's required to submit his budget for the upcoming fiscal year by the first Monday in February. And by April the 15th, the tax filing day, Congress is supposed to have agreed to a conference agreement between the House and Senate on a budget resolution. And I recall on many, many years when my parents were still alive, they couldn't understand why it was that they said we were fighting, say, on appropriations in September and October. Said, didn't you pass that budget back in April? And so there's a confusion out there about a budget resolution versus the final action of Congress. And a budget resolution is simply a blueprint. It is not the actual law. And I think sometimes that gets confusing to the average American outside the Beltway, so to speak.
I'm going to make one little editorial interjection here. One of the other things we are noting today is that we have released our quarterly index on Congress. We have a Healthy Congress Index at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which looks at congressional procedure broadly, coming out of a commission that we did, the Commission on Political Reform. That index measures a number of things, including how much Congress works in Washington and how many amendments they have, but it certainly does look at the budget process. And we do have some new looks at this Congress compared to other Congresses historically on how Congress is doing in the committee process. And I think we could certainly talk about Congress's failures as we go forward and getting the bills passed finally. But it is interesting to note that we've actually done a little bit better this time in the committee process. Don, do you want to just say a quick few words? Don is very involved. Michael Thorning,
Sure.
who's here in the audience, is also very involved in producing this index.
Yeah, I think that the Senate has sort of surprised us both by bringing out all 12 of the appropriations bills, having reported them. I think the House has reported 10 of the 12. On the floor action, the House is a little bit ahead because they've done a couple of omnibuses, one of which the Senate, we'll call them minibuses. One had 3 appropriations bills in. Last week, the House passed one that Interior and Financial Services. So the House has passed already about 6 of the 12 appropriations bills. The Senate has passed 3. I think they'll play catch-up ball, especially with those 2 that I just mentioned, plus defense. So they probably could go into the not the August recess, but come out of the August recess and go in to finishing up 6 bills, or at least being in conference on 6 of the bills.
So let me do another round here where we've talked a little bit about the history, but if you could each identify some of the key problems with the process, issues. Before we get to reforms and what might be possible, what is it that is not working as well that might be improved by reform or perhaps by just better governing and better congressional action? What's not working in the process as much in the last 10 years or so, Bill?
Well, and we'll come back to this because there is a reason why we are able to do the appropriation bills this year better than we have in the past. But in that regard, I consider basically 4 issues. The first one is timeliness, and we are dealing with that now. Timeliness is number 1. Number 2, I consider the issue of longer-term planning to be a major concern. That if the issues that we're dealing with here go beyond appropriations, when you throw in interest on the public debt, when basically 3/4 of the budget really is not in the appropriation area, I think we have to talk about long-term planning if you're concerned about fiscal sustainability going forward. I also think that simplicity, I hate to do the Eric Ueland back here, a staff director of Senate Budget Committee for many years. I hate to do it, but I carry around with me still to this day all the Budget Act points of order. It is a very complex system for the average staffer on Capitol Hill to understand how this system works. So simplicity is another problem. And then I guess whether it's simplicity, transparency, understanding, just being able to explain to the average congressman, let alone the average staffer, how this system works. Those are the areas, 4 of them, I guess, in terms of timeliness, long-term planning, simplicity, and transparency.
So I'll ask you the same question, Molly, but one additional point for you. The parties have changed over time. The parties become more polarized. Some would say they have, different, almost Rashomon-like views of the world today. What is it does this process work as well with the parties being as divided as they are, with there still being supermajority requirements of parts of the process? So broadly your thoughts, but specifically on that point.
No, and that's I think where I was going to go in my answer to your question, which is that if kind of bills for areas of emphasis are about, say, 10,000 feet. If we go up to 30,000 feet, for me, the biggest challenge for the contemporary budget and appropriations process is that it is asked to bear so much of Congress's political conflict because there's increasingly fewer places outside of the budget and appropriations process to hash out divisions that members have on all kinds of issues. So examples that I'll point to here include the fact that in recent years, one of the things that has often derailed appropriations bills in the House is members introducing very controversial amendments that are designed to be politically problematic for the other party. So in 2015, for example, there was I believe it was the Interior Appropriations Bill. There was a controversy over an amendment involving the Confederate flag. And so that got offered. Then Speaker John Boehner was faced with this decision between having some of his members cast a difficult vote on the issue or angering another part of his conference who really wanted the amendment in the bill. And so then the result was he just pulled the bill from the floor entirely, and the House did not go back to any more of individual appropriations bills in the House. We saw this in January when the issue of immigration got tied up with the issue of keeping the government open and passing another continuing resolution. So in a world where there are fewer ways for the parties to kind of hash out these political conflicts that they have, and they are increasingly large because of more polarization between the parties, I think the budget and appropriations process, particularly the appropriations bills, because they need to be passed in order for discretionary programs to keep running, become this target for more and more of the conflict that members need to hash or want to kind of hash out in the chamber.
And I know you've written specifically on the so-called vote-a-rama process, which is a series of very quick votes. Some would say, that lets the air out of the balloon, allows some of the members to put their priorities on. Let's Congress debate, but you're saying maybe if more of the rest of the process were open for those sort of things, members wouldn't feel like this is the only vehicle for these concerns, or more cynically, would you be worried that they would find any opportunity to be there as well?
So I think that when you think about members in both chambers, they come to Washington with things they care about, policy, political goals, and they're going to look for the chances that they get to try to move the ball forward on what they care about. And so if the only place they get to do that is in these symbolic show votes during the vote-a-rama, then we shouldn't be surprised that that's where they go to do this. And so I do think that, from my perspective, if the legislative process more broadly was working better, if, say, in the Senate, members had more chances to offer amendments on the floor on other things, if there were more, open rules in the House, or just more opportunities to offer amendments to bills in the House, that might take some of the pressure politically off the budget and appropriations process.
It might lengthen the process too.
That's.
Don, do you want to thoughts about what the biggest
first of all, we should
problems are?
clarify that vote-a-rama are amendments that are offered to the budget resolutions after the 30 hours is run out on the normal amendment process.
50.
But what I would equate that with in the House is the limitation amendments offered on appropriations bills, because we had the Interior Appropriations Bill up last week, there were like 170 amendments submitted to the Rules Committee on the Interior Appropriations bills. They only made in order, about 86, about half of them were Democrats, half were Republicans. But that is a lengthy process in and of itself. The House took 2 days, as I recall, to finish that bill. But here is the thing where members, and these are not poison pill amendments for the most part. The Rules Committee tends to weed those out now. But what they are amendments that tend to go to local concerns. And that's why you see so many of them, because members are very attuned to how government regulations, for instance, are affecting their farmers, their businesses, or whatever. And so a lot of these are called limitation amendments, which say none of the funds can be used for implementing Regulation 436 of the Environmental Protection Agency. And so this is why the House is putting up a lot of things that are controversial that the Senate doesn't want to deal with necessarily. And I think that's one reason the Senate has held back from even taking up House bills in the last few years, is the trouble in dealing with those amendments. The senators look more broad-based at their states. The House members are very concerned in standing up for their farmers, their constituents, their businesses, and so on.
So I hear the message, and I agree with the message that Congress and members of Congress could stand up and make the process work better, but there also are some potential process changes that we might make. And I think we have an interesting opportunity here, because we have now convened a joint select committee to look at the budget process. It's been going, and we'll make some recommendations, and several of you have been putting your ideas into that committee's work. And certainly both of the institutions done work on the budget process. So before we get to what's possible, what are the biggest things that you'd like to see? Why don't we? We'll start down with Don and work back down this way. Don, what are some of the biggest things that we would like to see?
Well, I will talk about some of the big things that joint committee is talking about in private now, which I think is good. They've had 5 public hearings, and the last one, not the last one, was with Panetta and
Obey.
And David Obey. But before that, they had a members' day where any House member or Senate member could come in and testify, and I think there were about 20 altogether. But the interesting thing for me in looking over the testimony was about 6 of those 20 members were appropriators. And to a person, they all testified against going to biennial budgeting, which is a big thing that I favored, Bill's favored, our bosses have favored in the past. But their argument, the appropriators' argument, is, why do you want to give up that much leverage on the administration by going from 1-year appropriations, where you can hold the feet to the fire of the bureaucrats, and go to 2 years? The argument on the other side is, we need more time for oversight, for authorizations. This would give us a bigger picture. Yes, we'll probably have to have some supplemental appropriation and so on. But that is the number one reform that's being batted about. Another one is to move the fiscal year from October 1 up to January 1, go to the calendar year. I think I testified when I was asked about it. I just said, I think it's not going to be workable. You're going to end up working between Christmas and New Year's now. Do you really want that? But there's a lot of folks that are coming out for that. The other ones, I just don't know of any real big ones that jump out, but Bill and Molly probably can recall. But again, I just tend to think that you can do some tinkering at the margins with the process, but that's not really going to change things.
I mean, the one additional thing that I think is on the table that I'll add is doing something to change how we deal with the debt limit. And there are a lot of sort of different pieces of that puzzle that you could move around. And we have some previous experiences with different ways of handling the debt limit that we could learn from. We have what's referred to as the Gephardt rule, which was used for a while in the House, which basically has a automatic increase to the debt limit in conjunction with the passage, the adoption of the budget resolution, something that we call the McConnell rule, which basically involves the president being able to request an increase to the debt limit subject to a vote of disapproval by the 2 chambers. So the thing that I think is kind of promising in that space is that not only is the debt limit something that a lot of people recognize has become a problem in terms of how we currently deal with it. But that there are a number of different options on the table and a number of different pieces that we can move around to try to find a more effective way to do that. I know that Bill has been involved in some conversations around how to do that. So that's the thing that I'd add to what Don has put on the table.
So we've got biennial budgeting, debt limit. I guess I'll take the third one, which would be we didn't rehearse this, by the way. Changing the structure of the budget committee membership. If you are going to have the budget committees, and quite frankly, Mr. Obey would do away with the budget committees. If you're going to retain the process and you're going to strengthen the process, from my perspective, then the budget committees should be leadership committees. I don't want to get into the weeds here. There are people here that understand this better even than I. But in the Senate, I won't speak to the House, but in the Senate Budget Committee is considered a B committee. That's kind of a throwaway committee. In the original act that set up the budget committees, let's be clear, the tax writing committees, the revenue committees, Ways and Means Committee, and the appropriators kind of dominated the structure of this, and so that's why they still kind of, budget committees are second tier to them. But if you really are going to set goals of how much to spend, how much to tax, what your priorities are nationally, I think if you're going to go this route, then you should have a very strong set of membership on the Budget Committee. And where I'm headed here is that the leadership, the chairman of the major committees and ranking members should be members of those committees, that being the chairman of the Finance Committee and the ranking member, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the chairman and ranking member of the Appropriation Committees, so that if you're going to get a blueprint together early on in April before they actually go to work, those committees have buy-in to the process from the beginning. So I think that I think is on the table. We had a discussion last week over at Brookings about this a little bit. I recall when Senator Hillary Clinton was elected, and one of her first committees, she was assigned to the Budget Committee. And pretentious on my part, but she came into the cloakroom, in the back of the cloakroom, and because my name was Bill, it was easy for her to refer to me as Bill, I guess. And I said to her, I said, Senator, why do you want to be on the Budget Committee? And she said, because my husband told me this was the best place to learn about how government works. And I thought to myself, we're not here as a civic lesson. This is supposed to be a powerful committee. But it was fine. She stayed on the committee.
Let me offer just a sidebar anecdote to that, and that is when the budget budget process was originally being debated in the Rules Committee, one of the successful amendments out of many unsuccessful ones that my boss at the time, John Anderson, offered was to have rotation on the House Budget Committee so that no member could serve more than 2 terms. I think it's 3 consecutive terms now out of 10 years, but that was adopted, and when he was asked about it, do you want to make it weaker than the Senate? And he said, no, I want to make sure that enough members have access to this process, that they have a better understanding of our overall budgeting system. And that was his argument, and it prevailed with the Democrats as well as with the Republicans. So I still think it was a good reform. I will not weigh in on which committee is weaker or stronger. I will say that the House this year has actually reported a budget resolution, and the Senate has not. I'll leave it with that.
So one thing that's interesting that you bring up, this question of term limits for members of the House Budget Committee, is that on the flip side, if you tell members that they're, when they go to serve on the Budget Committee, they're only going to be there for X number of terms, does that sort of disincentivize really investing in that committee service and learning, to Bill's point about should the budget committee be a place where members are supposed to learn about how the process works. Does it mean that in the House at least, we don't have folks on the budget committee who are really put in the time to become experts because they know it's going to be just a short-term committee assignment for them. But these are the kinds of questions that as we think about, making reforms to the committees in either chamber, power is largely a zero-sum endeavor. So if you're going to strengthen the budget committee, is that coming at the expense of the power of another committee? Part of why in the 74 Act, there was real concern in that process about from other members who had power under the current system about losing that power. And so as we think about what changes we might make to the committees, how do we grapple with the idea that if the budget committee becomes stronger, that's almost certainly at the expense of someone else?
Could I just add, John, we've gone about 30 minutes and I haven't even heard the word reconciliation mentioned in all this. And it does seem to me that just for the interns or the young staff, the reconciliation process only comes about if you have a conference agreement on a budget resolution. And the importance of this is that it takes care of that other 50%, 75% of the budget, not counting 50%, not counting interest on the debt. It deals with those mandatory spending programs or revenues, for that matter. And you don't have to reconcile, but if you have a blueprint that says we're going to have reduce our deficit in the future, it is a blueprint, and if you're not going to all do it on the discretionary side, it at least gives the strength to the budget committee to be able to direct committees of jurisdiction to make changes of laws within their jurisdiction to the word, I'm not a lawyer, you're the lawyer, effectuate the blueprint. The reason I raise this is that in 2000, we were projecting surpluses as far as the eye could see. $6 trillion in surpluses. And this was the CBO was projecting it. The Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan was projecting it. The wannabe incoming Gore administration was projecting. The outgoing Clinton administration, the wannabe Bush administration coming, and the Bush administration came in, and they had a surplus projection. The budget resolution in that year put in place a reconciliation instruction to cut taxes, not necessarily not to create a deficit, but to reduce that surplus to bring it back down to balance. It's hard to believe, but you can go back in history. Major surpluses can be as damaging to an economy as can deficits. Long story short, it was reconciliation that instructed the tax change to reduce taxes. Some of my colleagues, fellow colleagues on the other side of the aisle, were very upset with Republicans that we were instructing a tax cut through the reconciliation process. Why is all this important? Because if you reconcile and you get that budget resolution with a reconciliation instruction, then the legislation that's created, whether it's a tax bill or a spending bill or a mandatory spending bill, it is not subject to filibuster in the United States Senate. And I think the big issue, and then we won't get into the Byrd Rule and all the problems that go along with that, but I think the issue that strikes me as an issue between the House and the Senate is the filibuster and the 60-vote hurdle. And the only way we were able to accomplish some of the changes in fiscal policy, which I think during at least the 80s and early 90s where it's good fiscal policy, was because we had reconciliation. I presume there are those who would like to do away with reconciliation. If they do away with reconciliation, then I don't know why you need the budget process at all.
Bill has anticipated my next 3 questions, but I'm going
sorry.
to ask them again, or maybe ask you to all weigh in some ways, because I think Bill has put on the table 3 things that I wanted to discuss. So one, you mentioned as one of the worries about the process, the difficulty of long-term planning, especially since some of the process might not deal with entitlements, and maybe doesn't deal with the tax side, except for your exception here. So I guess I wouldn't mind you thinking about that more broadly. So if it's just a going back and using reconciliation as it's meant to, or whether there are some other things we can do in the budget appropriations process to really think more long term. That's one. So for Molly, related to this, you've written a book about exceptions to the rule, times where processes in Congress don't need a 60-vote supermajority in the Senate to get a vote, and their reconciliation being the most famous of them. There are others. Just some thoughts about how that's working or what changes might be made to that. And then Don, see, it's all set up. You raised all these issues.
Good.
I was going to ask Don about the House and the Senate. I mean, and again, certainly some of what's driving the worries about the change in the process is House worrying or being unhappy with the Senate's process that is a majority, often a supermajority process. So let's start. Well, Molly, why don't we start with you on the just broadly on majorities and supermajorities, and then we can come back to long-term planning in the House and the Senate.
Yeah, so I always enjoy listening to and talking to Bill about the reconciliation process. So I'm glad that we get to do it as part of this event. I think one big thing that I've been thinking about reconciliation recently is the degree to which its ability to get things through the Senate without the threat of a filibuster has made it in recent years, and I think 2017 was a great example of this, really attractive as a way for majority parties in the Senate to try to achieve kind of majority party defining goals. And so one consequence of that, and you can feel, I think depending on how you feel about the filibuster as an institution in the Senate, you might be kind of more or less okay with that idea. But related to that, and this goes back to something Bill said earlier about the 2 budget resolutions that Congress adopted last year, I feel like the existence of reconciliation in a very polarized system has in some ways made the budget resolution a thing that the majority party sees as its key to unlocking that reconciliation pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And so if what you really want to do is try to pass something through the Senate without the threat of a filibuster, and it's a big party-defining goal, in 2017, I think this was true for the failed attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I think it was true for the tax cuts. And you have to do that budget resolution if you're going to get the opportunity to use these procedures that mean you're not facing a filibuster. That really incentivizes you to do whatever it takes to get the budget resolution done at the expense of the budget resolution as a meaningful document that serves the blueprint for revenue.
Even if it's 9 or 10 months after when it was supposed to be done.
Exactly. Even off the schedule, doing all sorts of other sort of maneuvers within the budget resolution to try to get the necessary votes within your own party to get that across the finish line, to get the 2 chambers to agree on it. So it's not, I think, even separate from how you feel about the potential of reconciliation to adopt meaningful fiscal policy goals. I think that it, in recent years, has also had an effect of undermining some other parts of the budget process.
Yeah, Bill mentioned in passing the Byrd Rule, and I think it's important at this juncture to indicate that the Byrd Rule really confined what you can do in reconciliation. It has to be related in some way to either mandatory spending or taxes. And if you have things that are extraneous, they will be subject to points of order in the Senate, and that they can only be waived by a 3/5 vote. So quite often things would come back on reconciliation from the Senate where items had been knocked out on points of order. And so my boss at the time, the chairman of the Rules Committee, Jerry Solomon, would get down there on the House floor and complain about, well, we have to deal now with how we go forward without all those bird droppings. So he would refer to the provisions knocked out of the reconciliation bill as bird droppings. But then to get on to another point, and that is, John, you were asking about the difference between the House and the Senate, and what quite often holds things up. The House came out with the Republicans came out with a document either earlier this year or last year, Republican Party recommendations for reform, and one of the prominent things was get rid of the filibuster on motions to proceed. I don't think they confined it to appropriations. They may have, but that is something that the Bipartisan Policy Center has also weighed in on through its Committee on Political Reform, and that is, why hold up legislation on a motion to proceed when you should at least get into the meat of a bill, be able to amend it and so on. And I think we had the idea of a trade-off that you wouldn't have to have a motion to proceed if there'd been an agreement to have at least 5 majority amendments, 5 minority amendments. But this whole issue of the Senate filibuster not only took down a joint reform committee bill back in 1994 because the Democrats in the House said, we're not going forward on the Senate reforms that they want if they don't get rid of the filibuster. So this continues to be a problem now, but now it's obviously the majority Republicans in the House who are weighing in on this, as is President Trump. And so, this is something that is really a thorn, or something in the eye, at least, of a lot of Republicans in the House.
I just sensitive about this, the bird rule, okay, and the bird droppings that you're talking about. I have to recognize that this came about when we reconciled a committee, and Eric may remember, I don't remember exactly. I think it was Fritz Hollings' committee on Commerce Committee, and we were trying to get some Coast Guard user fees, I think it was. Small, that was actually a budgetary aspect. And so we reconciled Senator Hollings' committee. My recollection is, memory could be fading here, but Senator Hollings said, fine, I'll do the $200 million in Coast Guard user fees. This is before the bird rule. But I've had this trade bill that I've been trying to get through the Senate and have not been able to do it, so I'm going to stick it on when I report back to the Budget Committee. That was not the purpose of the budget resolution or the budget reconciliation. It was a budget process. If you open this up so that any authorizer that can't get his thing over a filibuster, he can slip it into reconciliation, then you've destroyed the whole purpose. That was the genesis which Senator Baker, one of the founders of BPC, as well as Robert Byrd, came about to say we should have a process that limits, make sure that only those things that have budgetary consequences are a part of the bird rule. There are waivers to it, as we all know. So Mr. Waxman in the House was very good at taking a reconciliation instruction and putting a bunch of stuff in that had nothing to do with it to get his health care issues through and send it back to the Senate. Yeah. And that was not that. So the House members figured out a way to play the game also.
I think that, the bird rule was good. I think that came in '85 with the Graham Rubb Hollings. That was a good aspect of how they limited reconciliation. The bad aspect was a guy named Claude Pepper, who was chairman of the Rules Committee then, insisted that there also be a provision put in there that said in reconciliation you can't deal with Social Security, which is counterintuitive because it's supposed to be the reconciliation is supposed to be dealing with entitlements. I
agree with you. Yeah. I agree with you.
So that's the Pepper rule.
So that brings you back to long-term planning. The one question I got some answer from you early on that we could, that reconciliation is something that might be able to address that. Does that work adequately? Are there other tools in the toolbox? If you could wave your magic wand and say the budget appropriations process should deal with more long-term planning, deal with the whole picture, including entitlements and tax and as well as revenues, what might you think that the process would look like if you could change in that direction?
Well, again, let's be clear. Don mentioned it, the famous statement from Rudy Penner, the problem's not the process, the problem's the problem. Any process reform is not, by itself, is not going to create solution that people want unless there's the political will to carry through some very difficult decisions they have to deal with. No surprise here, going back to Senator Domenici and work that we've done with him over many, many years. I am come around. I wasn't always in support of this, but this will answer your question on long-term planning, that I do believe that maybe changing the process to a biennial budget appropriation process might help. Why do I say that? I know there's still difficulties with it. But the issue here is not the appropriation committee for long-term planning from my perspective, it's the authorization process. And if we could free up to some extent the time that the authorizers, the ones that authorize that which can be appropriated, if we can free up the authorizers to do the work that they should be doing, to pass the authorization bills necessary to carry on government, I think that helps in the long-term plan. It won't solve all the problems, but it does seem to me that moving to a biennial budget, do the budget and appropriations, and this is hard, do it in 1 year, and the second year is the oversight authorization that provides the long-term planning. I do believe that might have some benefit for long-term planning. We'll get back to this, I assume, but the issue I see with the Select Special Committee is that the chairman, Mr. Womack, in the hearing that Don and I testified at, started the hearing by saying he wanted a neutral process, Halfway through the hearing, I was hearing senators and some congressmen saying they wanted an outcome, and they wanted the outcome to be a certain percentage of the debt to be a certain percentage of GDP. I don't know how you have a neutral process reform that forces an outcome. Quite frankly, that to me is Graham Redmond Hollings. Love Senator Graham, very smart man. Senator Redmond was, Hollings. When we changed the process in 1985 to say that here's a process that was somewhat neutral, but we're saying no, we want to have a balanced budget. Boy, that changed the whole system. Either you're going to have a process that is neutral, or you're going to have a process that forces these hard decisions. And my experience so far is they are not willing to make those hard decisions. So I ramble. I don't know where this is going.
So you began the next set of questions about what's possible. I mean, the two-year budget process is something that a number of groups have advocated for. We've advocated for. The committee, this committee is talking about. You've raised some of the issues with it. So how possible is it, and what are some of the other issues with it? Molly?
On biennial budgeting specifically?
Sure.
So there definitely appears to be interest in it as an idea. I think for me, one of the biggest questions, particularly given the makeup of the current Joint Select Committee, goes back to the point I was making earlier about the distribution of power within the chamber. Mm-hmm. So a number of the members of the Joint Select Committee are appropriators. And so a big question for me is, can you convince a current set of appropriators that it's a good idea for their work and their influence in the chamber to go from doing appropriations bills every year to doing them every other year? And there are a number of different sort of ways you could implement biennial budgeting, either doing half of the appropriations bills in 1 year and half in the other year, doing all 12 in the first year of a congressional term, and then using the second year to do authorizations and oversight work. I will say a few things that make me a few concerns I have about a potential move to biennial budgeting is, first, the degree to which to the extent that Congress is doing oversight at this point, a lot of it comes through the appropriations process. And so do we want to give up what is something that, to my mind, is still working reasonably well in terms of having the Appropriations Committee bring administration witnesses to appear before them every year? Do we want to forego that in exchange for a promise that may or may not get fulfilled for authorizers to do more oversight in year 2. That for me is one big question. Another thing that I often ask myself is what's stopping Congress from actually getting its work done on the current schedule that's afforded to it. And I think a lot of it is just that there's not the will to get the appropriations process done each year. And so in that sense, is moving to a biennial budget sort of a solution in search of a problem that's different than the one we're actually experiencing. But again, I think there is interest on the Hill in this issue. The question for me is, will you actually convince the set of members who are charged with adopting recommendations under this Joint Select Committee framework that it's a good idea?
Can we also get into two-year budgeting or anything else that might be, I don't want to call it low-hanging fruit, but more possible for this committee to tackle?
I agree with Bill that biennial budgeting potentially makes it possible to do better long-term planning, and I'm for that. But Molly raises the more practical question about how do you get that through the Joint Committee. But just to back up on the potential for the Joint Committee to do anything, when I looked at that legislation when it first came out creating the Joint Committee, I said to myself, and I think I emailed Bill, that this is kind of a committee that's designed to fail. Why? Because they need a 3/4 vote of the committee to report anything out. In other words, a majority of each house and each party. They need a 3/5 vote in the Senate to proceed to consideration, and they can drag that up. They don't have to bring that up until, well, the report doesn't have to be issued to November 30th. The Congress is due to adjourn around mid-December. I mean, this thing, even if it gets to a motion to proceed to consideration, which I doubt, it then is subject to filibuster in the Senate. There's no bar on filibustering. So why did that happen? Well, in asking some folks behind the scenes, they said Paul Ryan really wanted this to be done this year. So he wanted early reporting, he wanted votes in both houses, and so on. Chuck Schumer, on the other hand, in the Senate, wasn't too big on this because things could flip. Control of the Congress could flip, at least the House. So they did a trade-off. Schumer wanted another joint committee on private pensions, and so he said, okay, I'll give you this, but with these parameters. And that's really, to me, what was the fail, not the fail safe, but actually to me, a fail trigger.
All right, I'm going to go forward with one last round of questions, then we're going to turn to the audience, so get yourself ready with questions. There'll be a mic coming around. And that is to take off your purely budget hats, put a little more of a political hat on, and tell us what we're likely to see coming with this year's budget appropriations process. And you can throw in the debt limit as well if you'd like. Both what might happen and with the election coming up. And I want to praise Congress for how we've done in the committee process so far, but note that there are shoals ahead. So who'd like to start?
I'll try. I think they will get some. The appropriation bills are moving in mini packages, packages of 3. I think the Senate will do another package of 3 this week. So I do believe that there's a good chance that for the first time since in a long time, that there will be a number of appropriation bills that will at least be out of the Senate and House. However, conference. When I've looked at the votes on the Senate, those appropriation bills that are coming out of committee and those that have passed in the Senate floor have been fairly bipartisan. The bills coming out of the House have been very partisan. So I don't know if that bodes well for a conference or not. Nonetheless, I do think that there's a chance some of those appropriation bills will make it to the president before the end of the year. I know the president said he'll not sign another continuing resolution or omnibus bill. I think he better be prepared to sign another continuing resolution or an omnibus bill before the year's out. And I quite frankly believe that the Supreme Court nominee and other issues are going to dominate the whole system from now on out until the election, and therefore I don't expect much more than just a few appropriation bills getting done.
Holly?
So I agree with basically everything Bill just said. I think it comports with my expectations as well. I will say one thing on this sort of strategic choice by Congress to use these minibus bills. I found it quite interesting, and I think it in terms of thinking about how we might change the appropriations process going forward, I think it illustrates for me a really important question, which is what do we want the appropriations process to do? And if one of the things we want it to do is get done on time, thinking about things like using 3 bill packages that allow for kind of more log rolling across issues to build coalitions in the chambers, I think is a really interesting question. And so I think in that sense, that's been something interesting to watch and something that we should probably talk more about going forward. But in terms of what I expect to happen, I think Bill's point on not just the Supreme Court nomination, but also the Senate's continued interest in processing additional judicial nominations between now and the election. I think floor time is a scarce resource, and so I think that will also affect their ability to that and the pretty substantial differences between what the Senate is producing and what the House is producing will affect their ability to kind of keep up the same level of throughput that they've had so far.
Don?
Yeah, I guess the big question always looming as we near October 1st is, will there be another government shutdown? And there will be a lot of stories about it. In an election year, I don't think either party wants to have one because it's not going to help either one in the November elections, I don't think. But I could be wrong on that. As far as bills, I think Bill is correct in being very leery about predicting that so many bills will be enacted into law before October 1. I would say best case scenario, 5 or 6, probably more realistic 3 or 4 would be signed into law. So you are going to have a continuing resolution, and they'll be back after the election to patch things up.
Okay, we're going to turn to you with your questions, and please identify yourself and ask a question. So we can go right here. Sure.
Hi, Stacy Bridges, Veterans Vision. I was wondering, Congress hasn't met its deadline since 1997. And I was wondering, is it wise to run a superpower on a monthly basis? And why is it so complex? Do we have lobbyists writing the legislation? Is that why it's so difficult and so complex? And what can we do? And how are these tax cuts going to affect the average American, be it in housing, education, Social Security, what have you? How will these affect the average American?
So on the question of is it wise to run a superpower on a series of continuing resolutions, I think the answer is no. And one of the sort of things that you hear a lot about why uncertainty and lack of timeliness in the appropriations process is so damaging is because of the amount of uncertainty it introduces into agency operations, the Defense Department and elsewhere, and the challenges that having a series of short-term continuing resolutions and not finishing the work of a given fiscal year until the following, March or April, whatever it was this year. That is certainly one of the biggest drawbacks to having a process that doesn't work well.
Yeah, I would say that you have put your finger on one of the most important things that we tend to overlook in just talking about governing here in Washington, and that is its impact on those that are the beneficiaries of the appropriations bills out in the hinterlands, the state, local governments, the schools, hospitals, and so on. And it's interesting to me that maybe 20 years ago we first came up with the idea of advanced funding of education 2 years in advance. And now we're talking about month-to-month funding, and folks don't know where the next dollar is coming from. So I think, that is a shame. As far as what's causing this, yes, special interests are involved. Appropriations bills are really an agglomeration of all the special interest wants and needs. And you might say special interests are bad, but if you are a hospital administrator trying to get funding for certain things, you're a special interest. I mean, we are all part of a special interest, whether we admit it or not, and that's what the whole process is about, is trying to solve things or allocate things in a way that we are still being fiscally responsible, but at the same time, being responsible to our larger needs of our nation. So, I don't know that, that answers it, but to me, it's why it's gotten worse, I think, really gets down to something that Bill said at our testimony before the Joint Committee on Budgeting, and that is things have become so much more political and partisan that it's difficult to get anything done. And Nita Lowy said it best in an interview she had with one of the local Hill dailies, and that is, now you've got more and more members that are from districts where they're reelected 60, 70% every time. They have no reason to compromise. And so I think that's a big part of the problem, is we have less and less compromise as more and more members feel safe. They say, I'm representing my district, and therefore there's no need for me to give. And so they put up resistance to other people that are trying to do things differently.
I will note that in relation to that question, one of our founders here at BPC, Tom Daschle, former Senate Majority Leader, also one of our co-chairs of our Commission on Political Reform, made the same comment about our congressional schedule, which he said it's hard to run a superpower on a Wednesday. The Congress is here. So both are probably true. Yes.
Really appreciate the panel and the comments. One thing that, having followed this issue, and I've been with Bill on panels for a couple of years, but is in essence the grassroots nature of this conversation. We've talked a lot about process and sort of inside the Beltway and procedures and the Hill. One of the things that have been important to me is to make this conversation more understandable and make it a grassroots issue. And certainly I'm not a leader in that as compared to the Concord Coalition and Center for a Responsible Budget. But there's no, seems to me, or not enough at least, political imperative here, where voters just fundamentally reject the inefficiency of all of this and the fact that things don't get done, things don't get funded, things are delayed. I represented a housing group, and for 12 years we had a conversation about this every year so that they would understand the process and know how it affected them. And in this case, they were housing authorities, local housing authorities. And what is the effect on residents of the fact that the process that you've all talked about doesn't work? And yeah, I'm too a biennial budget fan, but I worry about, well, all right, we're now in a biennial process, and then we find a way to screw that up, and it becomes every third year. So I'd like you to comment, if you would, on the grassroots nature of this and whether or not there's any impact that could have on what you've been talking about.
So maybe we need to think about that Schoolhouse Rock video again for the budget process. But a good question for somebody to take, and maybe I could add to it. I mean, there are obviously ways that the public sometimes expresses itself in a very simple way. I can balance my own budget at home, but when trying to hold Congress accountable, and I think that's true of many issues, but on this process, there's no obvious way for the person at home to hold Congress accountable.
The government shutdown is an obvious.
Can I try? What I want to say is, as you know well, I like to say that governing is budgeting and budgeting is governing. It is tough. And the one thing that I have concerns about here is that we talk all about, you're right, we talk about this process reform and all. At the end of, I don't think most people care. They want their government to function. They want their benefits to be received on time. They want to make sure the water's safe, the food's safe. That's where it's at the grassroots level. My fear is that we'll go through this process reform and maybe we'll come up with something, but it won't change the outcome, because what's required here are fundamental changes in fiscal policy. And the difficulty, as you well know, is that what am I talking about? I'm talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I'm talking about benefits out there. And when you go out, as I do, to my Midwest home, the perception is, first of all, that we spend 50% of our budget on foreign aid or something like that, when it's less than 1%. Don't touch my Medicare benefits. Don't touch my Social Security benefits. Don't touch my farm price support benefits. Unless the American, and if, quite frankly, I admit, I'm a deficit hawk. I still think deficits matter. The difficulty here is that old saying, or Charlie Schultz, something about how termites in the basement. You'll never know, the termites are out there, you'll never know the impact that we're having until someday you step out on that porch and it collapses on you. What we're doing is, I think, talking about long-term planning, I think we're jeopardizing the future of this country by the level of debt that we're accumulating, because to me, it's simply a tax on future generations. To this lady's question earlier, I'm saying, I'm being honest with you. That means you really do have to take on some very, very powerful lobbyists to talk about changing what is based, not appropriations, but the entitlements, the mandatory programs of this country. And I don't think any process reform we've talked about today is going to change that. Am I too pessimistic?
Yes, right here.
I'm with you.
You want me to wait for the mic
Sure.
or not?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, please. Sorry, we got two of them.
Sorry. This is Susan Irving, GAO, and I've spent the last X years with my boss trying to make things simpler and screaming about this issue. I think, let me ask you, it seems to me the one thing maybe the Joint Select Committee can do is narrow the range of discussion and focus. Because where the structure, which I think does have to be outcome neutral, matters, is setting up a structure that, if people believe it, that will define not the analytic parameters of the debate, but the locus. So that if you're going to use minibuses, you permit trade-offs across the jurisdictions within the appropriations process. Because although that's only like a quarter of the budget, it's still, you're going to have to make that work well. But if you wipe that out, you wouldn't have solved your problem. And then, Bill, I think you need to work on mentioning both halves, because it's revenues and mandatory.
Yeah, I should have,
and
yeah.
if this, so maybe a lot of this discussion seems to get confused between the goal, which has to be reducing debt to GDP. And also, I was going to ask you all, it seems to me that 10 years may be exactly the wrong length of time. It's not a GAO position. Because if you look 5, it's too short for the things that are driving the long term. But it's long enough to pretend in a non-real budget resolution you're going to balance the budget, knowing you could not enact the laws that did that. Whereas 5 years is too short to play that game. And if you did something about, I don't know whether you do this, but something to allow a longer term outlook be relevant to the situation. And of course, I hope that maybe we can avoid risking default.
Yeah, so I think your point about the 10-year window being perhaps the wrong amount of time is an interesting one. I think one thing that you run into when you start to go longer than that is, I think the longer we go, the less certain we are about the information that we're getting.
In order of magnitude and direction.
And so I do, that's, I think, my first response to that. But I think your point about if nothing else comes out of the Joint Select Committee, the idea that we've had 4 members from each chamber from both parties spend the better part of a year having discussions about kind of narrowing the set of issues on which there might be future agreement. I think that alone is probably beneficial, and we will probably be better off for having done that. And so even if nothing else comes out of it, if we can get them to agree that maybe something about the timing of the budget process, maybe something about the debt limit, that sort of thing, I think there's value there.
All right, I'm going to put one last question to each of you. You are, I think we all agree that governing is hard and Congress is having a hard time generally. And we also all agree that there are some very difficult fiscal policy questions. So process isn't going to solve all of them. But in your more optimistic light, what are the things that you would say, look, I'd really like to see some small changes in the right direction that are improving the budget process that you might see out of this committee or in the next couple of years? What's on your list? And then if you want to add in what's your most optimistic look at how we're going to do this year, you can put that in too. So Don, why don't you start?
Well, as I indicated earlier, I'm not terribly optimistic about anything coming out. When we did the 1974 Congressional Reform Committee and we had the holdup between the Democrats in the House and their objections to the filibuster and so on, the solution was to come out with a base bill of minor changes so that it could be revised on the floor through amendments that were selected that would help improve it. That didn't really work. In fact, my boss at the time, Jerry Solomon, referred to the recommendations that did come out of the committee, just squeaked out of the committee on a barely bipartisan basis as a minimalist approach to tinkering. And I don't think, if you have that kind of result coming out of this joint committee, then it's probably not going to get to the floor even. And if you come out with something that's big and bold, which is difficult under the voting requirements to get anything out, that's going to run into problems too in terms of filibuster or pushback from special interests or whatever. So I wish I could be more optimistic and say something that would leave you in a sort of an optimistic mode coming out of this. But I think the only thing that shakes things up in Congress is some crisis, and that could be a turnover in party control of one house or both houses, although we've had that before, and lo and behold, nothing much changed. So party control is not necessarily the answer with basically the same actors. I don't know. I'm kind of stumped because I see the main problem in the House of a small group of people tying everything up and wanting unrealistic numbers coming out of Budget Committee and Appropriations Committees.
All right, Molly, you get a chance to be more optimistic than Don Wolfensberger.
Should be easy.
So if I were to pick some place where I was going to start, I would start with the debt limit. I mean, I think that is both important and there's the potential for movement. I think if I am learning something, and this goes back to something I said before, if I'm learning something about this year's experience that might be fruitful to build on in the future, it's this idea of potentially using minibuses and restructuring, getting out of the idea that somehow doing 12 separate appropriations bills is the only way to get good deliberative appropriations work done. And so I think if we get somewhere with having done conscious smaller bill packages instead of one big omnibus at the end, that has the potential to be something we can build on in the future.
Thank you. I want to be an optimist. I want to think that, kind of like what Sue Irving said earlier, I think they have to narrow their focus. I don't think they can be, as Don said, I don't think they can be so grandiose because that's not going in place. Too minimalist doesn't, maybe not do it, but they got to, I think if they don't come out with something, then people will say, well, wait a minute, you haven't, we established you to do something to improve the process, and you can't even come up with anything. I see it just affirms my skepticism that Congress can do anything, and that's not good. So I do think they have to come out with something. I think I would love to have Molly's outcome in terms of debt limit, fix on the debt limit. I don't think that's going to happen. I do think that maybe something in the biennial area is fine. I sure as the heck agree with Don. I don't think it makes any sense to move the fiscal year to January. We moved it in the 74 Act from July to October 1st to get things done. Moving it again, that's not going to do anything. And besides that, as an old staffer, you're going to ruin the only time I have of the year to be with my family. So I think on the biennial, I do think that we have caps on discretionary spending through 2021. The one prediction I can make, I feel very comfortable about, is that regardless of what this committee does, they're going to have to extend them again. And they're going to extend them for 2 years. And when they do that, the reason why I think we are getting appropriation bills done this year is because we had a mark. We had the 302A. We knew where we were going. So I think that something, and I would tie it to the biennial. So I hope that there's something in the biennial. I have a long list of things. I'd like a continuing resolution, an automatic continuing resolution. I'd like to I hate to say this, but we had something in the last time we had a major commission in this country. A presidential commission was 1967 on budgetary concepts. There are all kinds of issues that we ought to be dealing with. It'd be nice if they would establish a presidential commission on budgetary concepts. We haven't even talked about some of those issues. But if they can just come out with something, biannual budgeting or changing the makeup of the budget committees, at least they've done something. If they can't reach consensus, which I'm kind of with Don, it's going to be pretty tough to find that 3/4 of a vote. More importantly, to pass anything, then this is once again Congress can't fix their problems.
Yeah, let me just amend my pessimism and pick up on something that Bill said and something the Convergence Group testified to. He suggested making budget a leadership committee. I don't think that's going to happen because leadership doesn't want to spend their time in budget committee hearings and so on. But the idea is good in that the Convergence Group said at the beginning of the year, the calendar year, have a big leadership get-together where you are working out some solid numbers that can be enacted into law, so you're giving guidance then to the rest of the process. I haven't looked at the details that much. I'm not sure how practical it is, but the idea is have more upfront leadership rather than waiting for the leadership to try and snap tails at the end of the process and get things through without a government shutdown.
Well, coming to the end here, I'd like to remind you that we have just put out our quarterly index on Congress, the Healthy Congress Index. Michael Thorning, Don Wolfensberger, really very helpful in making that happen. You can find that at bipartisanpolicy.org. And I'd like to thank Don Wolfensberger, Molly Reynolds, and Bill Hoagland for the panel. Thank you.